Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board.
Growing more with less is the mantra of Nebraska's corn farmers, and they're using incredible technology to do it. Soil moisture monitors let them know when their crop needs water and how much. GPS systems eliminate overlaps in the field, saving fuel and money. New hybrids reduce the use of pesticides and increase yields. When you're talking new technology and innovation, Nebraska corn farmers are all ears. Nebraska's family corn farmers, sustaining innovation.
Market Journal, television for agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board.
Welcome to this week's edition of Market Journal. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. On this episode, Luke Beckman looks at corn and soybean markets. Bob Nielsen talks about challenges in corn production. Chad Engle describes livestock operations at the U.S. Meat Animal Research Center. And Al Dutcher gives his weekly weather forecast. Luke Beckman from Central Valley Ag is our corn and soybean market analyst this week. The USDA's latest monthly export numbers revealed a disappointing November. U.S. corn shipments were 18% lower than the previous November, and soybean exports were down 15% from November 2014. A strong U.S. dollar has continued to affect international ag trade, but will volatility in the U.S. stock market change that? We discussed that when we talked with Luke on the afternoon of Thursday, January 21st. Recap for me what's happened so far this year in the U.S. stock market.
Well, it hasn't been a really hot start. U.S. stock market, Dow Jones is down 8 to 9% depending on the day. We've had some pretty wild intraday swings. Just economy in general, you kind of look at what's happening with crude oil, and it's just commodity-wide, everything's been pretty negative. So certainly extends into the stock market. Globally, China's kind of in the same boat, and as China goes, the rest of the world seems to be following right now, just because they're not as hungry as they used to be.
Let's talk about both of those things, China and oil. Let's start in China. How real are the concerns in China?
Well, I think if you look at things from an ag sector, things are probably okay. I mean, you look at soybeans, their version of the USDA essentially expects Chinese imports of soybeans for their marketing year to actually be up about 8% for 2015-16. So they're buying soybeans. They're hungry for those types of commodities. It's some of the other areas that you extend into. How they utilize copper and some of those other raw materials, that consumptive demand seems to be down a little bit. And so that trickles into the economy in a lot of areas. And it comes back to the U.S., it comes back to producers in South America for things besides, just corn and soybeans.
We're talking on Thursday. It was a good day for oil today, not so much yesterday. What do you think its impact is?
The oil story really extends into a lot of different things. We're down 20 to 30% on oil, just depending on the day this year. We're trading below $30 a barrel. Pundits are talking about, that could go as low as 20. We could actually slip into the teens. A lot of places are not making money with crude oil where it's trading, but you have a lot of these Middle Eastern countries where, your GDP is so dependent upon oil. Regardless of the price, you're going to crank out as much as you can to generate as many dollars as you can. So we're just sitting on this glut of oil. Where it comes back into the U.S. economy and to farmers is certainly going to be how it impacts ethanol. That's something that we want to talk about. Spot margins in the ethanol industry have started to slip, and maybe we're starting to see that as ethanol production wants to start backing off a little bit. Now, while that might be a negative on the ethanol industry if crude's going to stay as low as it is, it's provided a couple of wild cards, if you will. First of all, energy is cheap. So if you're a producer and you're looking at, even the price of diesel fuel and what that's done and what you're able to contract or maybe fill your tanks at currently has certainly been positive. Secondly, with crude oil being a poor performer and the stock market being poor performer so far this year, you've got to think that the Federal Reserve is probably taking a look at interest rates. Initially in December, we ticked the rates higher by 0.25%, and the intention is that we're going to kind of stair step that up as we go through 2016. Obviously things aren't going super well in 2016 so far, so you probably have to look at that, and does the Fed deviate from that plan? If so, we probably had a lot of initial strength built up even into like the US dollar. And if we're going to deviate from that plan, do we see the dollar soften a little bit? And if so, that's certainly positive for the ag sector.
Where are corn and soybean exports at right now?
When you look at soybeans, down about 11% with sales and shipments so far. This year we started out slow. We've caught up a little bit, but that story's about done. I mean, our window to export soybeans is about over. You look at like corn, we're down about 20% there in terms of what we're exporting. One thing we really want to watch, Jeff, on the exports for corn is going to be Brazil's second crop. Their safrinha crop is going to be very important. Their soybean crop is late. They got into the fields late, which is going to back everything up a little bit. So will that impact their second crop corn? Will that create opportunities for the U.S. to catch back up in terms of exports and maybe cut into our carryout a little bit? We're going to have a good second half of 2015-16 in order to do that.
If you look at those three demand buckets for corn, right? Feed demand, ethanol, and exports. Is exports the one that's lagging right now?
Absolutely. It's a problem. The export picture really has the opportunity to swing that carryout, 200 to 300 million bushels either way, and we're kind of on the bad side of it this year. So far, ethanol production, feed demand have been very good through the first, quarter and a half of 15 and 16. So exports are to blame right now. If we could turn that around, or if there's issues in Brazil with what's happened in South Africa with their crop not being where it's at, we can start to pull back on the world carryout. The U.S. maybe has an opportunity to capitalize in the second half of this year.
All right, to close out, Luke, give me your price forecast for corn and soybeans.
I think that it's going to be fairly quiet. We have to watch what the fund short has done. We've picked up and added 20 cents to corn here since we made some new lows early on, and that's been positive. So if the funds can cover their positions, I think that you could see corn add another 15 to 20 cents, both on the old and new crop. So new crop pokes back above $4. That's probably something we want to look at. If you get the corn price on the board at a $3.75 versus March futures for the old crop, that's probably something we want to look at. On the soybean side, if we can flirt around that $9 figure on the board of trade for March futures, I think that's something that we probably need to look at. We get north of $9 futures on new crop soybeans. Maybe there's some different things we can do as far as putting floors in or looking at some other contract alternatives. But with where the carryouts are at, any kind of short covering by the funds is probably an opportunity that we want to take advantage of.
Next week, Mike Briggs will join us to look at cattle markets and the continued per-head losses in the feedlot. Avian influenza has reemerged in the United States. The USDA's Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service has confirmed the virus in an Indiana turkey flock. The strain, however, is different than the 2015 strains that killed more than 48 million birds across the country. This is the U.S.'s first case of avian influenza since June. The USDA is reminding consumers cooking poultry and eggs to an internal temperature of 165 degrees kills bacteria and viruses. The last month of 2015 was the warmest December on record for every state east of the Mississippi River, along with Iowa, Minnesota, and Missouri. For the whole calendar, 2015 ranks as the second warmest for the entire U.S. since 1895, falling short of the top spot set in 2012. At the Fremont Corn Expo recently held in Fremont, Nebraska, Purdue Extension corn specialist Bob Nielsen emphasized the inconsistent weather farmers face will make their jobs much tougher. We talked with Bob at the event about the necessity for good hybrid selection, managing the crop while maintaining appropriate costs, and the challenge growers have faced and will continue to battle with climatic variability.
I think it's probably the biggest agronomic challenge we face. And if you think about the last 5 or 10 years, almost anywhere in the Corn Belt, whether it's Indiana, where I'm from, or back here in Nebraska, we've had some of the strangest, most extreme weather events that most of us can remember in the short term. So we can't predict it. We don't know what's going to come next year, but I'll guarantee you there'll be something extreme. So the agronomic challenge is, how do we grow these crops? How do we make the right decisions that give us a crop that's healthy, vigorous, rapidly growing early in the season? Because that's the kind of resilient crop that is best able to tolerate the weather extremes. It won't prevent the damage, it won't stop it completely, but it at least gives that crop a chance to tolerate these unknown extremes that we can't predict And so for me, it comes back to agronomic fundamentals. We just have to get back to good, sound agronomic decision making on everything that we have control over. And that's really our only hope, I think, in the short term of addressing this climatic variability.
Do you think we've gotten away from some of the fundamentals?
We're humans. We tend to be lazy. We all take shortcuts. So intentional or not, I'd say yes. We just tend to farm the way we've always farmed. And I think we tend not to spend a lot of time on the details. And again, I'm not insulting anybody on purpose. I'm just saying that's humans. Yeah. So I think it takes a lot of effort to focus and pay attention to all these decisions. It takes a lot of time and effort to stay on top of the crop during the season and walk it, scout it, take notes, keep track of everything.
How do you find those yield limiting factors in your own operation?
You got to be in the fields. You just have to be in the fields. You can supplement that in-field, feet on the ground kind of technology with some of today's precision ag technologies like yield maps. I mean, my gosh, we've got 10, 15, 20 years worth of yield maps on our fields. Those are good visual illustrations of the bad areas in the fields. And at a minimum, they should serve as a map to tell us where to go in these fields to dig, and I say that loosely, to dig more deeply into what's causing the low yields, identify these yield limiting factors, and then that allows us to correct them later on. We have more and more use of remote sensing imagery, remote sensing data, whether it's from drones, whether it's from fixed wing aircraft, satellites, equipment mounted sensors like on some of these rigs around us that are using nitrogen sensors or crop reflectance sensors. So we have a lot of spatial or digital information available today that we simply didn't have 10 or 20 years ago. None of that is the silver bullet. None of it will diagnose what's going on, but it gives us a better ability to look at the whole field when it's, say, too tall to walk through or too challenging to walk through, and yet we can still get images or reflectance or sensor data off the whole field. And again, it's all about getting as much information as we can that then helps us navigate to these spots, start the investigation, start the diagnostics, and just gives us a wealth of information we never had before.
With the economic and agronomic challenges coming up next year, how critical is hybrid selection for corn?
Well, I really get on a high horse about hybrid selection because even though we have a lot of good hybrids today, everybody sells good hybrids. Even so, it's easy to find 20, 30, 40 bushel differences in performance, one hybrid to another, one year to another. And it's not so much about the differences in genetic yield potential among hybrids, although we need to pay attention to that. It's probably more so the differences among hybrids for how well they tolerate differences in stress. And this ties it all the way back now to climatic variability. We're going to get extreme weather events. We're going to have variability for things like diseases and nutrient deficiencies. And more than ever, we need hybrids that not only yield well, but yield well consistently. That's a challenge. And it's a challenge because it's reliant on getting your hands on a lot of variety test data, because that's what you use to determine or look for hybrids that yield well consistently across a wide number of locations. And that's important because a wide number of locations hopefully represents a wide range of growing conditions that your farm may experience in the coming years. So I think hybrid selection is critical. There's no question that across the board, today's hybrids are far better than they were 30 years ago. But nevertheless, there's still differences among the hybrids today, and it certainly is worth the effort to work with your seed dealer, not relegate the decision to them, but work with them to identify these hybrids. And I think that's probably one of the best, most productive things we can do to try and make these crops more resilient in the future.
All the things you said today and in this interview, do you think that lower prices are going to push us to farming in a different way or a more specific way, not only this year, but maybe years in the future?
I think lower grain prices simply encourage us to think more deeply about what we're doing. And I could argue we should always be thinking more deeply, but when cash flow is tight, when contribution margins are slim, certainly it makes you really reevaluate everything you're doing, or it should make you do that. And so that's what I'm encouraging folks to do is, let's look for ways to increase yield cheaply, but let's also look at all the inputs we're doing and And if there are inputs that frankly are sort of crop insurance inputs, we don't know if they're going to increase yield, they might, but we don't know. Well, maybe those are the ones you can actually do without, and unless you have some evidence that you need them. So I think it should make us reevaluate every agronomic decision we make, and then that should make us work harder at improving our own knowledge of agronomy, and that's hopefully why people come to programs like this, to pick up some bits and pieces of information. And I think it really should make you, I don't want to say obsessive, but it should almost make you obsessive about the agronomic decisions you make on your farm, and realize that what works this year may not work next year. So it's this always changing kind of environment that you've got to just stay on top of every year.
Our previous interviews from the Fremont Corn Expo include information on livestock expansion in Nebraska and corn hybrid selection. They can be found in the previous 2 episodes of Market Journal on our website. The University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Ag Economics Department has released 2016 crop budgets for the state. The yearly publication contains costs and prices for 73 cropping situations, including 19 scenarios for corn production this season. We asked UNL's Roger Wilson, who helped author the report, to explain what growers can learn from the latest set of numbers.
The interesting thing about this year's crop budgets is our break-even prices are lower for every crop that we do. We do 73 crops and they're all lower, and that's good since all the prices are lower this year too. Some of the reasons for that: lower break-evens. Our fuel prices are lower than they were last year by about $1. The fertilizer prices are lower than they were last year, which affects just about all the crops. And finally, we have a fee on there for a land use fee, and that's less since we use our survey, real estate survey, and those prices of land are down in 2015 compared to 2014.
You can find the 2016 Nebraska Crop Budgets through a link on the Market Journal website. The publication is free to download and use. It also features an additional video tutorial on how growers can use the budgets to fit their operations. The January Nebraska farmer says when Don Whedon had to replace several storm-damaged grain bins on his farm near Hampton, he opted to install a grain storage monitoring and management system in the new bins. Whedon is using a system to monitor the temperature at numerous points within each of the bins throughout the system. You can read about the procedure to protect stored grain in the January Nebraska Farmer. The second session of the 2015-2016 Farmers and Ranchers College was held Wednesday at the U.S. Meat Animal Research Center near Clay Center, Nebraska. A topic of conversation at this year's event was the U.S. MARC itself. About a year ago, the New York Times published an article critical of animal handling and welfare at the USDA site. An agency investigative panel visited the MARC after and found no evidence of poor animal handling, abuse, or inadequate veterinary care. At Wednesday's seminar, we talked with the U.S. MARC's Livestock Operations Manager Chad Engle about the impact of that article, the questions he receives from visitors touring the center, and the scope and size of the research location in southeast Nebraska.
We're 34,000 acres, about 8,000 cows, 6,400 head feed yard, 2 other species, sheep and swine as well. There's about 2,800 ewes and about 600 sows. In our swine operation, it's all federal property. The cattle are federal, except for University of Nebraska owns a certain portion of them, but by and large they're owned federally, and it's all done for research. The land was a formal naval ammunition dump. 50 years ago, it got removed from that and reassigned to the USDA, and the Meat Animal Research Center was born.
What are some of the research projects that you're working on here?
So I like to say we cover everything from conception to consumption and study it all in between. One of the longest standing and oldest projects that we have out here is the Germplasm Evaluation Project, or GPE, as it's referred to out here. And that's 18 different breeds of cattle that are from the most prominent used bulls in the industry currently, and their progeny are evaluated for everything from feed efficiency to fertility to docility, you name it. We look at it and get the data on it.
So about a year ago, the New York Times did a piece on the U.S. MARC, and it was kind of surrounded around animal welfare, not only now, but years in the past as well. How do you think that piece affected the operation?
Well, it was certainly something we had to work through. It was not consistent, with what we do on a day-to-day basis out here. We have really good stockmen. We have really good animal handlers, and they're compassionate and they care about the place and the animals. and I'd vouch for all of them. You know, if you had an operation at home, you'd let these guys run their cattle for you. They're really good at what we do, and that's been my experience since being here. Is we have really compassionate stockmen. They work really hard, and they do a good job of taking care of the land and the livestock.
You do tours around this operation as well. Tell me about some of the visitors that you get and what they know or what they don't know about livestock handling.
Absolutely. Well, we get, you know, everything from people from Scotland, England, to come here, Australia, to the local FFA chapter down the road. And so you really would be shocked at the type of questions we get. Everything from why do you confine a cow and feed it, to what are they eating, to I can see out there that you have all different kinds of colors. Why is that? You know, and it's really an eye-opening thing for me on how much information is needed to be put out there to the public. And if MARC can help serve a role in that, you know, it's a really fun part of the job.
Is it possible to change opinions?
Absolutely, and we think it's not. And I'm certain there's some people that you can't. But you never know who you're talking to. You know, you never know who's in that van with you or who's watching your operation. And I have a thank you note that I saved in my office from an individual that said that they were a vegetarian before coming to MARC, but after hearing about how we care for our animals, how we ensure the meat that they eat is safe, they were reconsidering their position. So there's always an opportunity to change minds, and that's something that's really rewarding.
You said in your presentations today that you guys have put a real emphasis on animal handling. Tell me what you mean by that.
So we are always collecting data. You know, we're always running animals through to maybe take a weight, take a hide sample, perhaps a little swab off there, maybe a nasal swab to see what kind of bugs are working on them. And so when you run those cattle constantly through a facility, animal handling is even more critical than normal, because those cattle really need to stay calm. They really need to work for you. So we spend a lot of time on training with our crews on how to do that, what to look for, how to ask those cattle to move, how to tell them where you'd like them to go, make it be their idea, and do it in a low stress and quiet way, so that when those cattle come through, there's not a great opportunity for injury, both to the handlers and to the animals. And we don't compromise the data. Those cattle don't get excited, you know, go off feed when they get back home, or maybe have less fertility because they're nervous. You know, we just really try to handle the cattle to take that factor out of it.
With 34,000 acres, how do you handle the grazing and the kind of the scheduling of all the day-to-day operations?
It's complex, and I like to joke when I give a tour that, you know, with 34,000 acres and 8,000 cows, this is a very diverse and complex operation, and that's before you add 45 scientists that are wanting to measure and score everything and write papers on it. So communication is really important, well-trained individuals, good facilities, all those things that we really try to work on. And in the grazing component of it, if we can get a little bit more out of our land doing it the right way, we just make a better deal for everybody. And I always like to think when people drive through the research center, I want them to be proud of what they see. I want them to see a well-managed facility, pastures that are grazed appropriately, cross-fenced, a lot of effort put in there, and guys that know how to handle the animals.
We've talked a lot about consumers, but for the cattlemen here today, what do they seem to be interested in, or from your day-to-day conversations with them, what do they seem to be interested in?
You know, they're interested in a lot of our data. They're interested in our feed efficiency stuff. They're interested in our breeding and fertility data. They're also interested in what's new. What's new with shade? What's new with animal handling? What are we doing with grazing? And so everything from production practices to meat quality and safety to how are we doing the day-to-day, turning the bolt, so to speak, you know, down to how many pounds of silage do you feed, type of thing. So I really enjoy talking with those producers. It's really a rewarding part of the job.
We'll have more from the Farmers and Ranchers College at the U.S. MARC on a future episode of Market Journal. We'll talk with Kansas State University's Mike Apley to learn what livestock producers need to know about the Veterinary Feed Directive. Now, with this week's weather forecast, here's Nebraska Extension Associate State Climatologist Al Dutcher.
Well, folks, here again for the weekly forecast. During this last week, we had two systems that impacted the Central Plains. The first one that came out late Monday and carried on through Tuesday brought light snowfall to eastern Nebraska with some moderate accumulations around the Omaha area and points across western Nebraska or western Iowa. And then as we got into Thursday, we've seen yet another system eject out of the southwestern United States and clip southeastern and south central Nebraska. And we had localized reports of 4 to 8 inches right along the Kansas-Nebraska border. And that system is the one that, as it moved eastward, strengthened and resulted in the blizzard activity that we're seeing ongoing in the mid-Atlantic states on the eastern seaboard. As we go through this next week, we do have one system that looks like it's going to definitely work into our region as we get to the latter half of the week and early part of next week, with a general warming trend and the potential as we go to the end of the month for a very significant system working its way in from the southwestern United States into the central and southern plains that may develop some exceptional snowfall in some locations of the central plains. So let's take a look at the upper model. Here is the activity on the west or the eastern United States, the blizzard that's ongoing in the mid-Atlantic states, and as slowly as this upper air low pulls off, we will see the precipitation come to an end either late this afternoon, evening, or early tomorrow morning. But as that system moves eastward, we'll start to see this high pressure system itself expand eastward, and that means for this weekend we should say pretty nice and sunny for the better part of the weekend for most of the central plains, looking at above normal temperatures. Everybody should get above freezing, and we might actually see some isolated 50-degree readings might actually make it in to extreme south central Nebraska. But more important, as we take our attention to the west, we have this storm system that's going to work its way eastward during the weekend, and by tomorrow we're going to notice it's going to start to impact the southern plains, and some of that moisture will start feeding up late in the day into the panhandle, and as this system progresses toward the east, we will see our precipitation chances increase, and both of these waves, both the northern stream and the southern stream, as they pass east in Nebraska, will merge to a pretty significant storm that once again will make its way to the eastern seaboard. So by the time we get to Monday, we can start to see that the system is getting its act together. We'll see the heaviest precipitation to our east, but we are expecting here, at least in Nebraska, the best chances for accumulating snowfall over north central northeast Nebraska, with lighter amounts as you move toward the south. As we get into Tuesday, of course, the system strengthens as it moves eastward. We got one little piece of wave on the back side of it, but it looks like it's going to impact more of eastern Colorado and points toward the south. And as we get into Wednesday, all of these start to pass toward the eastern United States, and we have one additional wave moving on the backside that will quickly move toward the south, bringing in a little shot of precipitation late Wednesday into Thursday, and then it's all sunny after that. Here comes that system Thursday, already moved down to the Texas Panhandle, and as we get into Friday, the ridge builds back in, a substantial warm-up at least through the end of the month, but this trough to the western United States looks like it's going to start moving into our region as we get into the 1st or the 2nd and develop a pretty significant event across the central plains. So as we look at the 8 to 14 day forecast, we're looking at that warmth to start to move toward the east, and in terms of precipitation, the models have a pretty good handle on successive storm systems moving across the country. So it looks like everybody at the end of the month and into the first week of February will see very wet conditions from the west all the way toward the east.
Thanks, Al. Today's interviews can be found individually on the Market Journal website and through the Market Journal mobile app. They include information on corn and soybean markets, corn production challenges, and livestock production at the U.S. MARC. As always, you can keep up with Market Journal during the week by following us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. Next week, Mike Briggs will be our cattle market analyst, and Nebraska Extension Public Policy Specialist Brad Lubin will discuss the importance of ag issues in the presidential election. Until then, thanks for watching. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. We'll see you next week.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources.